Welcome back to Political Science 101, American Politics and Government at Simmons College. This will be the second to last video. I'm going to talk about some stuff in this video you need to know for the final exam. Then on the next one, I'll talk a little bit about civil rights, particularly the civil rights movement in the 20th century and part of how it continues up until today. And on that next and last video, I will assign the final exam. It will not be difficult, and you can always reach out to me for questions. I know that some of you have reached out to me just recently for questions about different issues, and I try to get back as best I can. But I'll tell you one thing for sure. If you have a question about the final after I've assigned it, and I haven't gotten back to you in a timely manner, that's not your fault, and you will not be docked points for that, I promise you. So, with that being said, let's talk about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. These are big ones. These are important. These have a historical origin, historical basis, but they are still very relevant today. They're still very relevant today. They are what historians sometimes call the Reconstruction Amendments, because they came about and they were passed into law in a time period in this country known as Reconstruction. Reconstruction is a very vague term that refers to the time after the Civil War. The time after the Civil War. The 13th Amendment bans slavery. It says there shall be no slavery, with one exception. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. The 14th Amendment is one of the, if not the most significant amendments to the Constitution and one of the most significant pieces of the United States Constitution. It does quite a few things, but the one thing that I want you to remember for the purpose of this class and the purpose of the final exam is that the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law to anyone living in the United States or falling under the legal authority or jurisdiction of the United States. The 15th Amendment says no one shall be denied the right to vote based on race. Now, you'd think that the Constitution already said some of that, at least the 14th and 15th Amendments, and it does. Some of the amendments, in fact, several of the amendments to the Constitution, are the federal government coming back and saying, listen, in case y'all didn't hear us the first time, we're going to tell you what we actually meant. As I said in the last video, we have a real historical problem in the United States of not enforcing our own laws, of not actually following the law. I don't mean enforcing criminal statutes and civil laws that allow you to sue or how to defend against a lawsuit. I don't mean those laws. I mean rights guaranteed to the people in the Constitution. We have a history of not really enforcing those to the full extent. Let's go back in time a little bit. Prior to the Civil War, as you know, human chattel slavery was not only legal, but widespread, practiced in the southern states. It had been done in the northern states back when they were colonies. But prior to the Civil War, it was legal. Let's go back a little bit further. The Civil War was 1860 to 65. Let's go back before that, way before that, to the year 1619. In 1619, a European ship carrying 20 African people in bondage arrived on the shores of what is now the Commonwealth of Virginia, or the states, one of the states in the United States of Virginia. Back then it was the Virginia colony, a colony of Great Britain. So a piece of land that was owned by Great Britain. That's what that means. And there were British citizens there in the colony of Virginia trying to establish something lucrative, something that would make money for themselves and make a living for themselves and make enough revenue to send some back to the king, back to the British government. They decided, I'm going to really oversimplify this. They decided they needed more labor than they could provide on their own. And so They start trading in human beings from the African continent. Everything that happened after 1619 in this country, everything significant, has either a direct or indirect connection to that event and everything that came afterwards. Not just that one event of the one ship delivering people to human beings as property to the colony of Virginia, but everything else that happened right after that, everything that represented up to that point and after it. A really savage and brutal history of slavery in this country. Racist folks tend to use the word savage a lot to describe people who are not white. As I understand the basic definition of that word, it's far more applicable to the way that slavery was conducted and practiced as an institution in the United States. Very bad things were done on a very regular basis to a whole lot of people. And I think y'all already know that, but it's important to know that American slavery was the most brutal form of slavery. Brutal from a humanitarian standpoint. Most brutal form of slavery in the history of the world. So many different societies and cultures had slaves, but in the United States, the nature of transporting people across the Atlantic Ocean from one continent to another, the way that transportation happened, and everything that happened afterwards, from the physical and psychological treatment and the denial of rights, of any basic human rights, to Africans and people of African descent who were in bondage from 1619 till approximately 1865. And then everything that happened after, which will be for the next video, but everything that happened after that is a form. It's a manifestation of slavery that was just, again, more physically and psychologically brutal than anything the world has seen. The Romans had slaves. The Greeks, ancient Greeks, they had slaves. And that's just in the West. I mean, a lot of cultures in the East, they had slaves. Sure, they did not treat them well. I mean, they owned people. But so many aspects of how the institution of slavery was conducted in the United States. First, the British colonies that became the United States. It's unparalleled in its inhumane treatment of people. With that being said, not to be a downer, there was a war. There was a war over slavery. Lots of disagreements in this country prior to 1860 about whether or not slavery could or should continue. It ended up on a geographic divide of North versus South because their economies and the way that the people in those states made money were very different. Not to mention the directions that religious fervor took, and religious zealots and different types of fundamental Christians took, the different approaches they took towards slavery were polar opposites in the North and the South, particularly in the northeastern states versus the deep South in those states. If y'all want to know more about that, there's so much good literature available on this topic, and I can recommend quite a bit to you. Reach out to me and let me know. Happy to recommend some stuff, some good reading. But I say good. It's depressing, but important stuff. Important literature on this topic. But for this class, what you need to know is there was a war. It was a big war. It was the deadliest war in American history. Lost many hundreds of thousands more people in the American Civil War than this country did in First World War, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam. Roughly 700,000 Americans died. They were not all white. They were not all men. By the end of the Civil War, 1 in every 8 Union troops, that's the Northern troops, the ones who were fighting to end slavery, 1 out of every 8 Union troops was black by the end of the war. But the war happens. It's a bloody, deadly war. The war ends. The pro-slavery forces of the so-called Confederate States, they lost the war. The Northern states, the Union, the United States of America, won the war. I remember learning about this in grade school. Like, okay, the North won the war, and that was the end. There was no more slavery, so black people could just do whatever they wanted. Of course, that's not. Black people were like white people. It was all everyone's free and equal. Of course, that's not what happened. Of course, that's not the way it went down. But before we get into that, I first need to tell you about these amendments. In the 1870s, so the years right after the Civil War, Congress passes these three amendments to the Constitution, and then 2/3 of the states, as required by law, ratified, meaning approved these amendments. 13th Amendment, no more slavery, with one exception. Inmates, people who are incarcerated, they can be forced to do labor without violating the 13th Amendment. So that's problematic. But at least the amendment says no more slavery. That's unless you're a prisoner, which is a whole different topic. But that's a good thing. It's a good thing that there's an amendment that says no more slavery. The rest of it is probably the problem. But all you need to know about the amendment is it says no more slavery. I'm going to skip ahead to the 15th Amendment. It says no one can be denied the right to vote based on race or previous status as a slave, which that's less relevant, the last part, now than it was back when there were still so many former slaves, so many freed slaves that were still alive. But the 15th Amendment is still relevant because there are places all over this country today, there are states that are trying to deny people access to the polls, and the legislation doesn't say anything about race. If it did, it would violate the 15th Amendment. But it's implied. You can read between the lines, as they say, and you can see the racial undertones, sometimes racial overtones, of laws to restrict access to voting in the United States. But the 15th Amendment says you cannot just blatantly deny someone the right to vote because they're, well, it says it means black. It means you can't deny someone the right to vote because they're black. That's what it meant back then. But now it's relevant elsewhere. Y'all know I live in Arizona now. Well, Arizona, there are a lot of Hispanic people, and as a portion of the population, and of course there are efforts to deny Hispanic people access to the polls as well. So 15th Amendment is designed to prevent those kind of things. Does it prevent them? Sort of. It's one of these amendments where is it enforced properly? No. If we enforced it properly and meant it, if we meant what the Constitution says when it comes to access to voting and race, then it would be a better country, it'd be a better nation, and a better place to live overall. Now we're getting there. Hopefully, maybe not. I think we're taking some steps backwards in the last year or so, but it's in the Constitution. It's a good amendment, and if we actually followed it, we'd be a better country. Let's go back to number 14. Again, this amendment has several parts, and the one I want you to take a look at is the first part, the first section, and it says quite a few interesting things, but the thing I want you to take away from this lecture and what you should know going into the final is that the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law for everyone. What does that mean, equal protection? It means that if the law either gives me something or protects something of mine, some right of mine, it cannot deny that protection to someone else. Once again, is this perfectly enforced? No. It was passed almost 150 years ago, and no, it's not enforced flawlessly, not even close. But it is enforced. If you want to know how, the most recent big picture, like most recent obvious example, like a big media event around an example of the 14th Amendment being enforced, would be 2015, the Supreme Court case Obergefell, which said that if the government's going to let heterosexual couples get married, got to let homosexual couples get married too. People have very strong opinions on that topic, but it's in the 14th Amendment says equal protection under the laws. When I married my wife, I gained certain legal rights, and so did she. as relates to our relationship and our status under the law. Gay people in Kentucky did not have that same right until 2015, until the Supreme Court decided to actually enforce the 14th Amendment. When else was it used? 1967, in a Supreme Court case called Loving versus Virginia. There's Virginia again. Loving versus Virginia. Loving was the individual's name, last name, and Virginia was the Commonwealth or state of Virginia. Up until 1967, it was illegal in a handful of states, including Virginia and Kentucky, for black and white people to get married. Let me say that again. 1967, not that long ago. Both of my parents were alive and well. My grandparents were still young. I wasn't born yet, but it was not that long ago. I know a whole lot of people who were alive in 1967. That's not ancient times. It's not 200 years ago. It's just a few decades ago. White and black people in Kentucky and several other states could not get married. And if you went to some other state that recognized your marriage and got that marriage license and brought it back to Kentucky, Kentucky didn't recognize it. Which is a problem, because if a man and woman went to some other state, I'm sorry, this is Loving. If two white people or two black people, a black man, black woman, went to some other state and got a marriage certificate, marriage license, and brought it back to Kentucky, and they lived in Kentucky, Kentucky had to recognize it. That's a part of the Constitution called the Comity Clause, comity with a T, that says that every state shall recognize the kind of contracts and laws of other states. So if a black couple or a white couple went to some other state and got married and came back to Kentucky or Virginia or Alabama, that marriage was a legal marriage. It was a binding marriage, but not if they were one black and one white. Could a white person or black person marry an American Indian? Yes, but not a white person and a black person. Do you see the problem there? When the 14th Amendment says equal protection under the law. So in 67, the Supreme Court says no more of that. No more of that racist lack of recognition of marriages. A white person and black person, of course they can get married. Why not? What public interest does that serve other than racism? Which we hope is not a public interest. Other than racism, what purpose does that law serve? Those state laws not recognizing the marriage of a black person and a white person. So, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. I've been talking about rights to marry. Is that what the 14th Amendment was originally passed to do? No, it was actually passed, again, in the wake of the Civil War. It was passed in case states might do things like make a law that says we're going to punish crimes committed by black people this way, but crimes committed by white people shall be punished some other way. The 14th Amendment was designed to prevent that. Did it prevent that? No. So the next video, we're going to talk about Jim Crow and a couple other things. Talk about Dred Scott, talk about Plessy versus Ferguson, and I will assign the final exam. Thank you all for watching this video. Please don't forget to comment below that you've seen it. And I will post another video later tonight.